Federalism and Permitting Reform. Is the hour getting late? I want to welcome all of you here to the event and say it's wonderful to be back at yet another Federalist Society event here in the Mayflower, where I've been coming for years. You know, it's this hotel, beautiful facility, coming up on its 100th anniversary next February. And I was telling Nathan a moment ago that Federalist Society has had more events in this hotel than any other organization in town through the years. In fact, I distinctly remember being here for the 75th anniversary year and at a Federalist Society event. So I'm hoping to be here for the 125th anniversary when my brain will hopefully be uploaded to a bot of some sort, and I'll be continuing to terrorize the faceless bureaucrats of Washington, D.C. in some form or another. So welcome again. I do technology and innovation policy at the R Street Institute and a specific focus on AI. So I'm looking forward to engaging with these authors and their papers. Two wonderful papers are going to be presented here today on different topics. So let me just very briefly introduce our speakers and our commentator. I'm going to just say their sort of name, rank, and serial number. You've got all their bio materials in your conference information and online. But presenting first today will be Sarah Hunt, who's the president of the Joseph Rainey Center for Public Policy. And Sarah has authored a really terrifically interesting paper on artificial intelligence and critical minerals, looking at sort of the national security issues associated with these things and permitting reforms that are necessary. After she speaks about her paper, she'll go for about 10 to 15 minutes. We're going to hear some comments from Lieutenant General Mike Rowan, and he is a non-resident senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, Atlantic Council. The second paper we're going to hear today is by Evangelos Razis and James Cooper. So Evangelos is a senior manager at public policy at Workday, and James Cooper is a professor of law at the Scalia Law School at George Mason University. Their paper is entitled The Federalist Dilemma, State AI Regulation and Pathways Forward, a topic very near and dear to my heart that I write a lot about. And they already get high marks in their paper because I looked and they cite me 8 times, and so it's automatic A-, but it could go higher. But anyway, I look forward to this, and I'll have some comments on both the papers afterwards as well. So let's kick it over to Sarah to start us off. Sarah?
Hello. Thank you to the Federalist Society for having me here today. I have loved the Federalist Society since I was a law student, and it is an honor to be part of this event. I'm also excited to hear the thoughts that all of you have on my paper later at the reception. I hope you'll come find me and tell me. As a busy nonprofit executive and academic, I tried to get out of writing this paper by asking AI how to solve the permitting crisis. It replied, "File in triplicate and wait 7 to 10 years. Hope you lawyers aren't obsolete by then." I wish my paper topic were as jovial as I hope you will find me to be. Unfortunately, it's rather serious. We are in a time of tense geopolitical tensions. If you've turned on the news lately, you will notice that the United States faces a military coalition of adversaries led by China, supported by Russia, Iran, and North Korea. This coalition is actively developing artificial intelligence, or AI, capabilities, which are expected to revolutionize warfare. In fact, they already have. AI technologies are rapidly becoming a decisive factor in modern warfare, enhancing military systems with advanced capabilities like real-time decision-making, autonomous combat systems, drones, and predictive maintenance of equipment, more drones, but also other military equipment. Critical minerals are the foundation, the material connection to this digital warfare revolution. AI systems require advanced semiconductors, which are dependent on critical minerals such as gallium, germanium, fluorspar, and arsenic. These minerals are essential not only for AI, but also for other clean energy technologies and computing systems. And they will continue to be so, even if the AI learns how to 3D print it themselves. The United States is unfortunately quite dependent on critical minerals sourced from abroad. And even worse news, 58% approximately, of critical minerals used in semiconductors are processed in China or countries susceptible to Chinese influence, such as Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. For non-semiconductor production, it's 87%, almost 90% of critical minerals are processed via China. That's pretty scary. This leaves the United States dangerously reliant on potential adversaries, our single biggest adversary at that, for its supply of minerals essential to AI development and our military readiness. With China controlling so many critical minerals, we'd better hope their bureaucrats are as slow as ours, or we might actually need Skynet to save us. In 2023, China demonstrated its willingness to leverage control over critical minerals by restricting exports of gallium and germanium during trade tensions with the United States. We're in a pretty serious pickle, aren't we? Unfortunately, our domestic policy isn't helping us out. That's why I had to write a paper about permitting reform and mining and artificial intelligence. We have some serious domestic constraints on mining. Our domestic permitting processes for critical minerals mining are so painful and unending, the Chinese probably consider it part of their slow-motion warfare capacity at this point. Although the U.S. possesses significant deposits of many of these minerals, including copper, which is essential for AI data centers, domestic mining is hampered by outdated regulations and a complex permitting process. For example, federal mining laws still rely on the General Mining Law of 1872, which has not kept pace with modern mining technologies. Mining under this decrepit statute is like trying to tweet by sending a telegram. Technically possible, wildly inefficient. The burdensome environmental regulations that our mining companies must face in our new AI arms race include federal statutes like the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. NEPA and other environmental laws introduce layers of bureaucratic delays, where the review of environmental impact statements alone can take 7 to 10 years for mining projects. This is significantly longer than countries like Canada or Australia, where permits are typically secured in about 2 years. NEPA is so outmoded, it's another policy even environmentalists think needs to be recycled. How is permitting reform a national security imperative? Well, as I've stated earlier, we cannot make the chips and run the computers or even have the energy production capacity we need to compete in the AI arms race without the ability to mine critical minerals and to source critical minerals domestically. Given the strategic importance of critical minerals, any delay in mining permits weakens U.S. military and technological capabilities. Without an overhaul of the permitting process, the U.S. will struggle to maintain its edge in AI technology, which is frankly critical in the face of increasing Chinese military aggression, particularly in regions like Taiwan. There is some hope, and I'll talk a bit more about this later. We've got the Energy Permitting Reform Act, the EPRA, which was recently proposed in 2024, which the Senate has considered, which the House is considering now, offers some progress by shortening litigation timelines and allowing for mineral processing on federal lands. But it fails to address the more fundamental problems, such as the modernizing of the General Mining Law of 1872 and streamlining the NEPA review process. Those of you who are nerdy enough to follow this the way I do will have noted the recent NEPA reform for chips that passed in a bipartisan manner and that Joe Biden has signed into law, I believe by now. I want to point out that while this is hopeful and good progress, it's quite narrowly tailored and applies only to a few projects that are building manufacturing facilities for semiconductors themselves. It does not involve to mining the materials that are needed to make those semiconductors. The EPRA proposes a 150-day statute of limitations for lawsuits against mining projects and provides for accelerated judicial review, which would expedite decisions on permitting disputes. The act, however, does not directly reform the mineral permitting process itself. The great news is that there is traction for this bill. I hear it's even bipartisan. Impressive and almost as rare as getting a mining permit in 5 years or less. There's still need for broader legislative changes besides just what is being contemplated for the EPRA. True reform will require expanding the critical minerals list to include key AI-related materials like copper, which currently does not qualify as a critical mineral under the Energy Act of 2020. Comprehensive overhaul of the General Mining Law of 1872 to align with current mining technologies and speed up the discovery, location, and operation of mining sites on federal lands will also be critical. Now this leads us to a fun new wrinkle in all of this. And I know at the Federalist Society we've all been quite excited about the conversation we're having in the post-Chevron world. This is a big deal, and it's a very big deal in this area. And it will have impact on legislation and permitting pertinent to mining for critical minerals for artificial intelligence. In 2024, the Supreme Court decision in Loper-Bright overturned a 40-year-old precedent of Chevron deference. It's nearly as old as I am, as a matter of fact. This previously required courts to defer to federal agencies' interpretations of ambiguous laws. Now the courts themselves must consider statutory language more closely. The agencies might even need to follow the statutory law, and what next? Perhaps Congress will begin reading the bills they pass before they pass them. It's quite a time to be alive. There are serious implications for permitting reform. This ruling means that Congress must now draft clear, detailed laws governing the permitting process. For instance, if Congress decides to reform mining law or create more exemptions under NEPA for semiconductor manufacturing and critical minerals mining, it will need to specify the exact parameters and leave less room for agency discretion. Ambiguities in the law could lead to prolonged judicial reviews, further delaying critical projects and posing a threat to our national security with those delays. As illustrated by the hypothetical scenario in the paper, where the U.S. forces regain control over Taiwan through AI-driven technologies, I had ChatGPT write a mock New York Times article about a warfare situation involving AI. America's ability to compete against China's military and AI development depends heavily on securing domestic access to critical minerals, and we're not going to be able to do that without serious permitting reform. In other words, we may have a software advantage, but China has a hardware advantage as long as they are controlling the supply chain for critical minerals. I've got a few more proposed solutions and specific recommendations. In addition to expanding the critical minerals list, we should streamline NEPA for critical minerals. Congress should introduce categorical exemptions for critical minerals mining under NEPA, similar to those granted to renewable energy projects under the EPRA or the manufacturing or the building of manufacturing facilities for semiconductors under the recent NEPA for chips legislation. These exemptions could apply to low-impact mining activities or to operations deemed essential for national security. We should also look at creating specialized permits for critical minerals. Drawing from the Clean Air Act's permit by rule approach, critical minerals mining projects should be eligible for pre-approved, streamlined permitting processes, which would reduce paperwork and delays by allowing companies to use standardized permits. Advanced site preparation by federal agencies could also go a long way in terms of expediting permitting processes and, frankly, starting to dig dirt and get those critical minerals out of the ground. Agencies like the Bureau of Land Management should conduct preemptive environmental rules and data gathering on potential mining sites, speeding up the permitting process for critical minerals by providing companies with verified site data. It also could maybe create less to argue about in court with radical environmentalists. A National Commission for Federal Land Transfers might be considered. This could be similar to the Base Realignment or Closure Commission, which handles military base closures. This commission, done correctly, could help fast-track land allocations for mining crucial to national security, especially if it is targeted and viewed through the lens of this national security imperative. The United States faces unprecedented military challenges from China and its allies, who are increasingly relying on AI to enhance their warfare capabilities. Without swift permitting reform, the U.S. will remain overly dependent on foreign sources of critical minerals, leaving our military and technological infrastructure vulnerable to our most significant global adversary, the Chinese Communist Party. Immediate legislative action is needed now in the wake of Loper Bright. Congress must act quickly to modernize permitting laws to ensure reliable domestic access to critical minerals. Failure to do so will jeopardize the United States' ability to compete in AI-driven global conflicts and maintain our position as a military superpower. The hour grows late indeed. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to have some questions for you in a moment, but let's turn to Mike first for his comments.
Sure. So let me start with, I think maybe some of you saw me in the hallway and I have a different lanyard on here. So I will tell you, about 4 blocks from here, NVIDIA is running their Artificial Intelligence Conference. It's in the Reagan Center and in the JW Marriott. And it is massive. And there are thousands of people there and hundreds of vendors that are pushing technology into the AI ecosystem. And so it's the scale and the juxtaposition of what we're talking about here today and what maybe the rest of industry is talking about today, the industry that depends on critical minerals and many other components to actually continue to build capability, is like a really important conversation. We talked a lot in here about large language models, and I think one of the things that I think is important, large language models is one artificial intelligence phenomenology, and because it's based on words, it is so enticing to humans. What I saw 4 blocks from here today, it's not language that they're talking about. They're talking about data across entire ecosystems. Data from satellite imagery, data from outputs from machine processes, data about scheduling at ports and shipyards, data coming from electric cars. Like all of these things, these don't run on large language models. So like our understanding of artificial intelligence and the transformation that is underway really depends on us. Understanding LLMs, yes, but the rest of the ecosystem is so important. And this is where I think we talk so much about artificial intelligence. We talk about LLMs as an it. What does it say? What will it do? I would like to give you a different perspective, and that is artificial intelligence in many forms as parts of process and achieving outcomes. Many of you know John Deere as a company. Many of you may know the example of John Deere as an AI powerhouse. I did not look at the numbers today, but in 2017, John Deere bought River AI, and in that company, combined with John Deere's broad ecosystem of farm equipment and farm processes, turned it into a global powerhouse. It is, I haven't looked at the market cap today, but generally it's about the same market cap as Lockheed Martin, right? So here, a farming company, a tractor company, now has the economic heft and the markets for that rival our largest defense manufacturer. And so I think it's really important that we understand like what we're really talking about when we talk about AI. What they're talking about 4 blocks from here is a massive transformation in accomplishing outcomes. And some things that I heard over there are things that might be worrisome to some. For example, NVIDIA, who ran the conference, is looking at not only AI application across broad swaths of capability, but also to drive the development of robotics, right? And to drive the ability, through the combination of AI and robotics, into like ecosystems of capability. Think like a product line architecture, where you build an ecosystem of capabilities and the components that you build plug into that ecosystem so that you can then achieve your outcomes. These ecosystems really mark the future of where artificial intelligence is going. When I think about what we should maybe be concerned about with artificial intelligence, I don't think about large language models. I think about how do we build large-scale infrastructure that allows us to be competitive and economically competitive and competitive in the outcomes we hope to achieve, but also doing it safely and doing it with the right responsible AI applications and the right controls on what we do in these large system processes. I think that's a really important way to think about this. And a lot of the conversation that I think that we should be careful of, when we talk about AI does this, then we're probably not thinking deep enough. We need to think about humans using AI to do this, right? And so human-centric AI development is kind of the core of what they're teaching or they're preaching down the road, but it's also the core of when I was working with AI in the Department of Defense. Like human-centered development, human-centered engineering, human-centered safety, human-centered defining objectives and ecosystems. And this is such a critical component of building a safe and secure AI environment. And I will assure you that in the Department of Defense, which I left a couple of years ago, that is the topic of the day, and it still is to this day. How do you build safe and responsible artificial intelligence ecosystems and applications? So let me shift now just a little bit to what Sarah was talking about. You know, when we think about artificial intelligence and advanced technology in defense, there are a lot of things that can raise your eyebrows, right? Like how important is it? And is the Department of Defense managing this effectively? Are we building killer robots in the basement, or are we in the open building capabilities that will help us achieve our objectives? And the answer is the latter, of course. The Department of Defense is rigorous in its application of military technology. And with artificial intelligence, that hasn't changed. But here's kind of the rub, and here's the connection. What we are seeing with this broad transformation of artificial intelligence and other phenomenologies, other technologies, is a redefinition of what competition means. Global competition means something different now. We thought we've practiced global competition as a military competition, for example, or a market competition. But now we see, and especially worrisome, what's especially worrisome to me is the hold that China has on the global south, if you think of the global south writ large. And the global south is actually where much of the mineral wealth and the opportunities lie. So here we have a very effective defense establishment that we've built through an AI lens, but also through an ethical lens and from a materially effective lens. We've learned a lot from what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, for example. So like we're moving all of those things in that direction. But just as we get to that point, we find that that's not good enough. We find that suddenly other markets really matter to us. Finally, the Ukrainian example, Ukrainians have, lots of long-range missiles to be able to defend their cities, but they can't target effectively because they don't have the range. Like here is something that they didn't plan to compete on, and now it becomes part of part of the competition. So in this broad competition with China, now we have to think about artificial intelligence in its role as a competitor in the competition for China. Artificial intelligence has to be something that we prioritize, and in the same way, for shipbuilding, for relationships with countries around the globe, for looking at technology. What's interesting about China's AI ecosystem. It's really hard to have an AI ecosystem, an information system, if there's large bodies of information that you don't want told or you don't want repeated. And so they have their own constraints, but they have been incredibly effective in turning especially small nations around the globe into fear and suspicion of the United States and its allies. And they're leveraging that, or they're using that now to constrain critical minerals, to constrain, transit rights. We have a large set of problems. Technology is in the middle of it. Regulation is in the middle of it. Our military competitiveness is in the middle of it. And our economic competitiveness is in the middle of it. We can't be sanguine about minerals, but we can't be sanguine about any of these issues that we have as a nation today. Thank you.
Excellent comments, Mike. Thank you for that. Sarah, you want to respond to that before I ask you a quick question?
I agree.
I loved your paper, Sarah, and there's so many questions. But I wish I could put up for the audience page 11 and 12 of your paper, because what Sarah's done is she's documented like all the many layers, all the regulations, permitting processes, everything else, federal, state, local level, that hold back our ability to really be as innovative as we could be on this front as it pertains to access to critical minerals and other things. And then you get at the question of like what it's going to take to like finally shake things up. And this is really interesting to me as someone who studies this a lot, especially because you cite one of my favorite tools or mechanisms that I've written about myself, which is the BRAC Commission, the Base Realignment and Closure Commission, which is basically an instrument that was set up to get around a problem we had in the post-Cold War period of how we were going to actually close down some older bases or consolidate some bases when no member of Congress was ever going to allow that to happen. It was like a classic prisoner's dilemma problem, like how we were going to solve that, because everybody was going to vote to keep my base and close somebody else's. And so it was an interesting reform instrument that was created by Congress to say, like, let's bring together a group that can agree on this in a consensus-driven way, but it's kind of a vote thumbs up or thumbs down on the whole package to make it work, not just like itemizing one at a time. In closing your paper, you talk about the BRAC model is one way to maybe start the reform process or shake things up a little bit. Could you maybe give us a little bit more details on like how you envision that could work, and do you think it will work in this current political environment?
One thing that I would point to is the EPRA, which was almost like a mini BRAC. Senator Manchin has become quite good at this, whether it was the IRA or the EPRA, where he got colleagues together and worked things out. And in the EPRA case, of course, it was bipartisan, and he and Senator Barrasso did it together. And they lined up a lot of support from senators that you might not usually expect to support it. They had Mike Lee on board, they had Martin Heinrich on board, they basically have Sheldon Whitehouse on board. These are people from a wide range. So in that sense, I think it is possible. Elevating it to something more formal like BRAC would be a BRAC type model would be to elevate the critical nature of this national security imperative. And while I know the BRAC type model has been tried for other issues, perhaps with much less success, the question here is we must come to a conclusion, or our national security is at stake. The future for an open future for all of our children is at stake. The quality of the environment is at stake. Our military preparedness is at stake. Our economic leadership is at stake, and quality of life for not just every American, but as the Lieutenant General points out, the citizens of the Global South who are being exploited, arguably. Quality of life for many people all over the world. And when you are faced with, we must do something, or we have a threat vector that is going to destroy us across all of these important fronts, I think it could be very successful.
Well, it's interesting. I'm a little bit more skeptical, but I'm actually more of a believer in what you say in your paper on page 16 when you talk about the shifting policies of industrial politics. And you point out whether it's the CHIPS Act or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, that quote unquote industrial policy is now once again the quote law of the land, and it's a fundamental shift in federal policy. The U.S. government is openly now picking winners and losers, or at least categories of sectors of winners and losers, you say, motivated by mercantilism, geopolitics, environmentalism, and so on and so forth. But then you brilliantly point out that like this has kind of also forced a lot of people, especially on the left, to try to finally open their eyes to the cost of all of these rules and permits. And it's kind of strange that it took like an explosion of renewed interest in industrial policy to get many people, especially on the left, to realize like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of barriers to doing sensible things in this country. So maybe it's just more practically, instead of something like the Bragg Commission, like, could it just be that like it takes an industrial policy to get permitting reform in this country? Is that where we're at?
Yes, in some ways. I like to give my friends on the left a hard time by telling them that I don't think the Infrastructure and Jobs Law or the IRA would be possible without Donald Trump socializing industrial policy, and frankly, without significant conservative and Republican contributions. I had a paper in Issues in Science and Technology in 2021? 2022, the years run together, called the Emerging Republican Climate Policy Framework. It was quite a bit before the IRA, but if you go through and read it, it has a tripartite or three pillars of conservative approaches to managing climate risk. And you read it and you say, oh my goodness, it's the IRA. I've gotten several emails about that. Apparently, I have great precognition on these things. So we are seeing the left start to adopt ideas coming from the right. We are seeing the left start to adopt these conversations, and it's important. That's why we all love the Federalist Society, right? Because folks show up from the ACLU, and we get to debate them about issues, or they show up from other entities on the left or from academia, and we have these disagreements, but we also find areas of agreement, and I think that is, look, I'm not necessarily crazy about industrial policy, but it's what we've got. I like to say that I don't think the government should pick winners and losers. It should only pick winners. And, when we are looking at a national security problem, like artificial intelligence, like competing with China, that is a place where many of us agree that government should engage. It's not influencing a market that is in the private sector per se, or for those reasons. It's not saying, hey, we like Walmart better than Target. This is a national security matter, and if we don't do these things, then we're all at risk.
Well, thank you, Sarah. That was wonderful. And we'll have some more comments or questions for you from the audience in a moment. But first, let's turn to Evangelos and James to talk about their paper, The Federalist Dilemma, State AI Regulation and Pathways Forward. I believe, Evangelos, you're going to start?
Thank you, Adam. I should also start by thanking the Federalist Society. I think we have the distinction of being the last paper for the day. It's been really a fantastic symposium, and appreciate the opportunity to present our paper. I lead AI and privacy policy at Workday, a cloud enterprise software company where I have the front row seat to AI discussions and consumer protection issues at the federal and state level. An important disclaimer, any views I represent today are those of my own and not those of my employer. I'll first tee up the dilemma facing federal policymakers, which at first glance seems to be a simple choice of patchwork or preemption, and then hand it over to Professor Cooper to discuss the pathways forward. So as today is a testament to, AI seems to be on everybody's mind. And we've seen a great deal of focus from policymakers about AI's potential harms to consumers, from fraud to data privacy violations to unlawful discrimination. For those who follow technology policy closely, the story of the past decade has been of the federal government ceding the field to the states on issues of regulation. Whether it's data breach notification, comprehensive privacy laws, or now kids issues. All of these, which are inherently in terms of interstate commerce or regulating digital technologies or practices that are interstate in nature. In DC, whether in Congress, the administration, or regulatory agencies, and frankly, both sides of the aisle, the answer to a new set of technology policy and consumer protection issues is not usually to enact a new policy framework or governance framework out of whole cloth. Instead, it's to apply existing laws to new problems. This is a very sensible instinct. AI does not exist in a legal vacuum. There are laws of general application in the consumer protection space, like Section 5 of the FTC Act, that apply to the use of AI. But it does create a vacuum for states. States acting as a laboratory of democracy is typically a good thing. In our federal system, states are also intended to be more responsive to citizens' concerns, and there's no shortage of concerns around AI or technology more generally. Yet uncoordinated state action and state regulations has trade-offs, notably a patchwork of uneven protections for consumers and regulations that only the largest companies can navigate. One study from ITIF, this is a few years old but still relevant, found that a 50-state privacy law legal patchwork would impose a cost of $1 trillion in compliance for firms that engage in interstate commerce. And I think, as the previous paper, I think puts very well, there are geopolitical implications here. If the U.S. has a fragmented internal market that inhibits American AI companies to develop and scale, that has a negative impact on U.S. competitiveness, including in the competition with China. And despite a great deal of attention from AI, to AI from Congress and actions from the Biden administration, we're seeing the same dynamic play in AI, in the AI policy landscape. The Biden administration issued an executive order, which I'm sure many are familiar with. It's quite long. And we've seen the FTC and other regulators make clear that their existing legal authorities apply to AI. But this hasn't stopped states from taking action. Since the public release of ChatGPT-3, AI and consumer protection laws have been enacted in Utah, Tennessee, and California. The most comprehensive is Colorado's AI Act, or SB 205, which was signed into law in May. It regulates the development and deployment of AI for consequential decisions, such as employment, housing, or credit, and is specifically targeted at algorithmic discrimination, which is a new term of art. When a law is comprehensive, as Colorado's is enacted, the usual response by many observers, including Governor Polis, who signed the law, is to call for federal preemption. Yet the situation is more complicated than a single law or a recent uptick of interest by state lawmakers. This is because state AI regulation didn't begin with ChatGPT-3. It began in 2018 with the California Consumer Privacy Act. The majority of comprehensive state privacy laws, and for those who don't follow this on a day-to-day basis like I do, we're up to 19 states with comprehensive privacy laws. All of them regulate AI, both as frameworks of general application, applying to almost all collection, processing, and transfer of personal information, but also through specific provisions on automated decision-making. This is a concept that's borrowed from Europe, from the General Data Protection Regulation. In other words, the horse may have already left the barn when it comes to the state patchwork on AI. The choice before federal leaders then appears to be, one, enact a preemptive national regulatory framework for AI, privacy, or maybe both, or continue with a very considered and prudential approach to AI and consumer protection, but also cede the field to the states on AI regulation. Realistically, ceding the field to the states is the default scenario. If we've learned anything from efforts to enact comprehensive federal privacy reform, it's that arriving at a tenable compromise position on technology regulation requires significant political capital, both to agree on a framework's substantive rules and the nature of preemption. For political reasons, then, it's probably safe to say that federal comprehensive privacy is unlikely to come about, just like a comprehensive federal AI law is unlikely to come about. Nor is there a reason to necessarily believe that an overriding federal approach with preemptive authority will yield better outcomes for consumer or innovation. Many of the proposals in Congress would impose large burdens on users and developers of AI, which threatens to chill innovation in this vital space with uncertain gains for consumers. As Adam has written, there's at least one licensing regime that has been proposed for AI and frontier AI development. And for those familiar with technology policy, licensing regimes tend not to be associated with a particularly innovative or competitive market. And as Professor Simoncelli in the previous set of panels flagged, the EU's experience is helpful here. In the wake of the General Data Protection Regulation and other heavy-handed data regulations, Europe's tech industry, or native tech industry, took a bit of a hit. Lack of competitiveness, it was frankly helpful for some American companies if they're willing to pay for extractive European fines, but needless to say, it had an anti-competitive effect in Europe. So now, to the point now that even EU leaders, in the form of Mario Draghi, are expressing alarm about the impact of the AI Act on the continent's AI industry. And for those who have not read the AI Act, or perhaps those who are having difficulty sleeping, I would recommend reading it. It is really grounded in a product safety approach. So they're regulating toasters the same way they regulate AI. So now that I've laid out all of the problems, I will hand it over to Professor Cooper to solve them.
Yeah, that's, and when you need problems solved, you always call a law professor, right? That's what, that's a joke. So, just to ask my students. I have a former one right next to me, so he can attest to that. So what I think what we point out in our paper, if there, the contribution or to this, and we owe a large intellectual debt to Adam, as we'll get to. That was our price for getting on this panel. Is that in some ways maybe this is a false binary that we want to explore, that it's either preemption or patchwork, that maybe there's some in-between ground, that again, we owe an intellectual debt to others who've thought of these, and we want to apply some of this to AI and think through this. The first would be a moratorium approach, and this would just be a freeze. It would be not quite preemption, where preemption is you take a big federal regulation and you tell the states that this is the law, we're preempting your laws. This would just freeze state and federal action in this area, allowing everyone to kind of take a breath, take stock, and I think one of the primary benefits from this is we would be able, not in addition to kind of taking the breath and taking stock to see what works best, is it would stop ill-conceived federal legislation that's just pushed out in order to stop ill-conceived state regulation, right? And we've seen that in, so we've seen this in other contexts. The privacy context we have yet to end up with a privacy bill, but there was a lot of strange bedfellows after California came out in order to push some federal bill, even if it wasn't perfect, just to stop the patchwork or to stop the Californiazation of the U.S. Now, there are precedents for this approach, and again, we owe an intellectual debt to Adam, who has written about this, and pointed out that there are some precedents for this. There was a moratorium on internet taxation originally, when the internet was sort of nascent in the 90s and then made permanent. And then another example, which I was not aware of until I looked at Adam's work, is commercial space flight as well. That is set to expire soon, and we've seen that, that came into being in 2004, when who would have thought that there would be, commercial space flight in the way that we have it now, but now when we rely on SpaceX to pick astronauts up from the space station, I think I would not have envisioned that 20 years ago. So that's one possibility, is this moratorium, and I can't necessarily speak for my co-author, but I see this as probably the preferable path, even though there are some serious, from a policy standpoint, I think it's the preferable path, but I do think there's some serious practical problems with this in the AI context. One, as Evangelos already talked about, is this is kind of a harder to cabin than these discrete issues of, say, internet taxation or commercial space flight. AI is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. And then there's the sort of the horse out of the barn problem, right? I mean, we already have one AI law, and we have 19 state privacy laws, many, if not all of which, implicate AI to some extent. So another issue here is, and I think this is more, and people, there are many people in this room who know more about politics than I do, but we're in a fairly, what I would say, sort of anti-tech environment on both sides of the aisle. And it seems that every time you turn around, you hear we've got to do something about AI from everybody. In fact, today's recipient of the Nobel Prize in Physics resigned from Google and has said that he regrets inventing AI because it's going to destroy us at some point, right? And so this is kind of this is the world we live in. So I don't know if there would be the political will. Again, I would leave it up to others to kind of think about that more deeply. The other kind of in-between option we posit is a choice of law, kind of a federalist competition option, right? Competition among states, and I think I'm contractually obligated to come up with that because of I'm at Scalia Law, home of Larry Ribstein, the late great Larry Ribstein, who really pioneered the idea of federalist competition in corporate law and a variety of other laws. In fact, we have a workshop, a law and economics workshop named after Larry. So it's inspired by his work, and as well, recently Jim Harper and Jeff Manny had kind of, I want to give them credit as well, they had been thinking about this in the context of state privacy laws as well, but it really owes the intellectual debt to Larry Ribstein. And the idea here is kind of simple, is that states would just compete by providing different AI laws. Now, how would that work in practice? I mean, there are really two necessary competition or necessary conditions for that to work. Is one, that states, courts would have to honor choice of law contracts. Or so if I'm a consumer and I'm using a product that incorporates AI and I've consented to what's likely to be a standard form contract that I probably haven't read, but that doesn't really matter in a lot of contexts. I mean, the court has said, look, form selection clauses, things like that, even if they're boilerplate are likely to be honored. Its choice of law is less, perhaps less likely in some states to be honored, but that is that's one necessary condition, is we've got to have state choice of law in a contract honored by courts. The second condition, and this is also, there are potential problems with this, is that we need to have the incentives to compete on this dimension by states. And states, of course, are not these monoliths. They're made up of individual actors. It's easier to think of competition in the corporate law area, because if you have great corporate law, then you get people incorporating. There's money, right? It's an easy way to see why and we see competition. I mean, obviously there's Delaware, but Texas and other places are starting to compete. We see competition, of course, in providing tax breaks to get all over, to get industry to come to your state with the idea that the front-end tax break will be more than compensated for by the back-end revenue that it generates. In providing AI law, I have to admit, and as we point out in the paper, it's not clear the extent to which states are going to have a strong incentive to compete to provide efficient AI law. One thing that may drive this could be that, if your state becomes the state in which that is the choice of law for every every company to govern their AI contracts, then maybe that's a boon to your legal industry. Maybe that, and again, but it could also work in the opposite way, right? There's that you could compete to have the most punitive AI law because your trial lawyers are pushing that in the state legislature. We certainly see that the trial lawyers do have, have a strong lobbying. So those are the necessary conditions, the extent to which it'll work out. The last two things I'll mention that this choice of law framework, one is we're often, as I just, kind of worried about a sort of race to the bottom in the sense you always hear that states will compete and in order to provide the most lax regulation. But I mean, that's not necessarily the case. If consumers actually value some, whether it's privacy or discriminatory protection from AI, they want to think their AI is safe like a toaster, that you as a firm may have an incentive to sign up for the good AI law, right? And then you could also imagine to say, well, but no one reads these contracts. Well, that's true, they're buried in fine print, but you can also make your AI promises salient. There's a strong, there's what's called the unraveling principle in economics, that you have this idea that firms have strong incentives to clarify complicated things if they think it's going to move demand. All you have to do is look at, say, DuckDuckGo and Apple in the privacy domain to see that. There's also, unlike normal competition where collusion is per se illegal, states can collude. There's no problem with that. So if you're worried about a patchwork arising from this competition, we see this in the privacy law domain where we see states kind of cooperating to say they don't want to necessarily be an outlier, small, maybe California doesn't matter because it's giant, right? But other states may decide, I'd like to kind of go along because I'd like to look like everyone, I'd like to look like everyone else. And again, that sort of collusion is okay in state competition. So with that, I know we're right up against time. I'll just say, in conclusion that number one, I want to thank, I didn't say this before, thank the Federalist Society for inviting us here to present our work. And number two, maybe we should think through not just the binary of patchwork versus preemption, but maybe think of some more potentially creative solutions, each of which with their own problem, but they're definitely worth thinking about. So with that, I will end.
Thank you. Wonderful. So let me follow up with a few questions about your paper. I thought it was an excellent piece. I have lots of questions. This is what is all-consuming topic for me at the moment about what to do about this dreaded patchwork. It's really the patchwork of all patchworks. Let's be clear. In the United States, as of this morning, there were 762 AI-related policy measures in the United States pending. That's just state. That does not include municipal enactments or proposals. As Evangelos knows, because he's out there in the trenches fighting these day to day on a lot of cases, some of the most important things are happening at the municipal level. New York City, San Francisco, even Miami-Dade County is interested in AI policy. City, state, county, every layer, and then we haven't even talked much about, an international one and all the sort of Brussels effect problem. And so, this is a really pressing issue because as all of you have noted, Congress, it just doesn't get around to acting on technology policy much these days, sort of become a non-actor in terms of moving the ball forward on a lot of issues, thus leaving the sort of administrative state to fill in a lot of gaps at the federal level. And then, as you said, Evangelos, sort of like the states being the default place where policy gets done for better or for worse. So getting to a question here, this wasn't always the way it always was. Let's think back a little bit in time, just 25 years for those of us who were present at the birth of the internet and internet policy in this country. The Clinton and Gore administration, working with Republican Congress, came up with a bipartisan framework for global electronic commerce that sketched out a very light touch approach that incorporated an effort to rely on contracts, best practices, multi-stakeholders, and so on and so forth, but with a good degree of preemption involved, both directly within the Telecommunications Act of 1996 as passed by Congress, but also then subsequently with the Internet Tax Freedom Act of 1998, and with a host of other things that were being implemented at the agency level. That example of preemption was sort of deregulatory preemption, like a more thou shall not edict to the states, like you will not be taxing in a discriminatory fashion these new thing called the internet and broadband. You will not be regulating and creating new barriers to entry like you did in the analog age for broadcasting and cable. You will not be doing this and that. So that's one model, and you won't be surprised to hear I like that one. I like it a lot. But it was a rarity in a sense, because we do get other preemptions that are of a more regulatory variety. So we already have AI preemption in the United States at the sectoral level for things like algorithmically enabled medical devices via FDA regulation. We already have AI preemption in this country in the form of aviation, Federal Aviation Administration regulations for drones. In fact, it's why they can't get off the ground, quite literally, in this country, because the FAA pretty much won't allow for it. So that's of a regulatory preemption variety. But the point is, we used to do this. This used to happen. And it doesn't anymore. And so now we're stuck kind of looking for gimmicks, including the one that I've suggested and you guys were kind enough to endorse. Like, let's just have a moratorium and take a time out here for a moment and stop and think about what we're doing as a nation before we run into the problem that Mike aptly noted, which is that, like, this goes back to, like, fundamentally a relationship between our geopolitical competitiveness and our national security. And if we get this wrong by shooting our innovators in the foot, you know, it could have really deleterious consequences for us as a nation. That being said, I can't get anybody in Congress to act on this. I work very closely with the House AI Task Force and Chairman Obernolte on that, and Co-Chair Liu. I work very closely with the Senate Commerce Committee. There are 115 AI bills pending in Congress right now. Not a single one of them involves preemption, as I can see. Not a single one, of a deregulatory or regulatory variety. And when I last testified on this matter, I got a whole bunch of grief from lawmakers, especially Democratic lawmakers, who said, oh, we're for a certain amount of preemption, but it has to be more like floor preemption, like we'll regulate over and above what the states are already doing. To which I had to say, Congresswoman, that's not preemption. That's not the preemption we want, at least. That's just more layers of complexity and compliance cost. So the situation looks as grim as you gentlemen have identified it in your paper, but I'm not sure even with a moratorium like I suggested, it does much to help. Now, maybe the choice of law model does, but there are still some questions about how those choices are made and how much it incorporates. Because the fundamental problem as I see it with AI policy at the state level is that AI is not one thing, not one field. It is multidimensional, amorphous, and even the definitions of AI are ever-changing and unagreed upon. The GAO famously came out with a report in 2019 saying there is no consensus definition of AI, and in federal law currently, there are 3 different definitions of AI on the books. And at the state level, they're running crazy with all sorts of other definitions, but that's not even the biggest problem. The biggest problem is the multidimensional nature of it means there is an attempt to regulate AI at a general purpose macro level as sort of regulating AI qua AI, and then there's the sectoral targeted kind of siloed approach of like AI and fill in the blank. AI and energy, AI and elections, AI and energy, AI and cyber, AI and whatever, right? And there's bills on all those things and more. So the challenge ahead of us is even more complicated and troubling, I think, than the scenario you've laid out in your paper, which is already quite grim the way you guys laid it out. And I'm just not sure how to deal with this. I mean, does a crisis force the hand of Congress? Does it, you know, if California would have passed their big bill that Newsom just vetoed on regulating at the model level, would they have tried to do something about that? You know, and he vetoed it, but at the same time, Newsom passed 17 other AI bills in the preceding month and a half. 17. I think Illinois passed 5 in a week last month, and New York's off and running with dozens. I'm painting a grim scenario here because I want you guys to really help me unpack exactly how we would get at this if we wanted to. And of course, you're trying to deal with the pragmatic, you know, practical reality on the ground, which is that Congress just doesn't move. Evangelos, you said it best. If the privacy experience teaches us anything, you know, we have at least a decade of trying for a baseline, comprehensive federal privacy approach and never getting it, right? After all that effort, unbelievable amount of effort. And a lot of strange bedfellows diverse coalitions came together on that. Still couldn't get it done. So in my view, absolutely zero chance of comprehensive AI legislation at the federal level. If we get AI legislation, it'll be narrowly focused, and it won't involve preemption. So in light of that, you know, choice of law, is that our best option? Or do we go state by state and come up with a framework for, like, I know ALEC has done this among other organizations, and I'm writing about this right now for Federalist Society, like come up with model legislation to counter all of the sort of like bad legislation. This is what we've done on privacy, right? We've gone state by state, state house by state house. and fought to get better policies for privacy. But I would argue this, privacy is definitely narrower than AI, right? And so, I mean, how many model bills do we need on this? Help me out here, guys.
I'm happy to maybe take a stab at that. I'm also going to be counterintuitive. Yes, I guess the paper is a little grim, and the situation is, there is some reason to despair, but we shouldn't dwell in the despair. At least that's not my choice. I would say there are some reasons to believe that this is not going to be a complete patchwork of 50 radically different regimes. And there's a few reasons to believe that. First, the political level, there is a group of state lawmakers state senators, state House representatives, who have, in a bottom-up way, which meet on Zoom meetings pretty regularly, and I mean almost from every single state in the country, tried to collaborate to create a common baseline framework. Is it perfect? Is it a single unified draft? No. Is it going to cover everything under the AI sort of universe? No. But I think to Professor Cooper's point about sort of collusion, this is what collusion among state lawmakers look like in practice. It's a sort of bottom-up federalism. And what you find is provisions within certain aspects of this law that are meant to be interoperable or interlocking to at least mitigate some of the costs of the patchwork. So I'll give you an example. Impact assessments are a requirement that are pretty common in most data governance or technology governance regulations. So essentially, it's a process where you identify, document, and mitigate certain risks. So under the Colorado AI Act, if you carry out an impact assessment, there's a sort of interoperability provision. If that impact assessment looks like an impact assessment done in another state, it qualifies. So that requirement is already filled. There's a leveraging of international standards and federal benchmarks like the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, AI risk management framework, which is sort of a best-in-class how-to guide for enterprise risk management in AI. So I would just say state lawmakers have agency in this picture, and many of them understand many of these same trade-offs in ways that sometimes folks in DC like to discount. I sometimes am guilty of that as well, but there are some reasons to hope.
James, do you have a comment on that before I follow up?
No. In the
so
interest
just-
of time, that was, I could not add to it.
Okay, because what's interesting about what you said, Evangelos, is that first of all, like the Colorado bill, it's a pretty regulatory model of sorts, right? And maybe there's consensus among the people who are meeting there in Connecticut and other states, but it involves either algorithmic impact assessments on the front end and AI audits on the back end, or both in some cases, depending on the model. And on amorphous grounds of so-called, as you pointed out in your paper, algorithmic discrimination. I have a paper for Federalist Society with Neil Chilson called The Coming Onslaught of Algorithmic Fairness Regulations, and that's the world we live in now. Every state has their own different variant of like what they mean by algorithmic discrimination. And even though we have plenty of civil rights remedies and policies on the books and consumer protection laws, this is like an additional layer over and above that. But then what's even more interesting about this sort of regulatory framework that's emerging is that a lot of it, as you pointed out, is loosely based on a non-regulatory framework developed by a non-regulatory body at the federal level, the National Institute of Science and Technology within the Department of Commerce. So this is a soft law model that would basically say, take our voluntarily agreed to best practices in a risk management framework that was developed through a sort of consensus-based process with industry and their stakeholders, and give it enforcement teeth. Now, what's interesting about that to me is like this is a group of states giving a federal non-regulatory risk management framework enforcement teeth at the state level. As a legal matter, somebody should write a paper on that. They should also write a paper about like what happens when an executive decree that can easily be changed by another president then empowers said body, non-regulatory body, to create a whole cloth, new bureaucracy called the AI Safety Institute that will develop more standards at the federal level, but without clear federal regulatory teeth. I'm very, very confused about this form of constitutionalism. This is a really interesting thing, right? Because, I mean, that could be changed at any day. I don't know if, if you're a compliance officer, a lawyer, or a counsel working at these companies, like, I don't know what your legal rights look like when you're talking about a non-regulatory framework at the federal level that's been given enforcement teeth at the state level. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, you make it sound dire. But I would say that, I mean, just to play a little devil's advocate, and I'm only doing it because that's what law professors do, is if it's duly enacted at the state level and they've decided, I mean, I don't see, it'd be one thing if NIST all of a sudden had regulatory authority, right? Or there was some reason based on that you had to follow NIST. But if a duly enacted state legislature says we want to follow NIST and companies operating here follow NIST, I don't think it's necessarily, I mean, we may not necessarily like it as a policy reason, but I don't think there's necessarily a constitutional crisis there. I think that
except that it's not a law.
It becomes a law once the state of
It's best
Virginia.
practices, right?
I know NIST is not, but if you decide, I mean, you as a state legislature can decide to incorporate all manner of standards to follow. I mean,
Right.
this is something that I know a little bit. I mean, my area is, consumer protection law and the FTC, and pretty much many states have a consumer protection law, which looks to the FTC to say, okay, well, we'll interpret our state consumer protection law consistent with how the FTC interprets their Section 5, right? And a lot of how the FTC interprets Section 5 is through policy statements, which are just policy statements, but nonetheless, by having that in your law. So I agree 100% that NIST is just standard, but if I'm a state legislative sovereign and says, I want that standard to be the law of my land, then I think it may be bad policy. I'm not going to disagree with you on the policy side. I mean, again, I would like this just to be, the problem is it'd be great if there was paralysis and we just stopped and nothing happened but the problem is I don't think that's happening at the state level.
The states are going to move, right.
The federal level is paralyzed and states are filling the vacuum, and
Right.
it could turn out, and I know our paper is sort of grim, and
But not as grim as I'm being.
not as good. But the only thing I would say, and I'll defer to my co-author, who again is on the ground and knows more about this, is that, there was all the push for, we needed to stop the CCPA, right? And
This is
I
the California
wonder,
Consumer
the California
Protection,
Consumer Privacy Act, and that's what was driving the federal privacy. And I was actually at the FTC at the time that was going on, and it was almost 100% sure there was going to be a federal privacy bill. The Chamber of Commerce was on board, everyone was on board. But I wonder, and again, I'm almost asking my co-author here, is to what extent did you look at that and say, well, the CCPA really, I mean, I guess you have to take that into context with the GDPR. Like, really, the compliance costs may not have been as bad that, because I know the CCPA, there was all this thought that, do not sell my data. How is it going to work out? And it turns out most people don't click do not sell my data. It really hasn't had, at least as far as I understand, hasn't had a huge impact. So maybe we have federal paralysis, and the states may do their thing, or like federal breach notification laws. That was another thing that was going to be, oh my gosh. And now every state has a breach notification law, and law firms counsel their clients to figure out how to deal with those fairly easily. It's not a huge lift, from what I understand. So I don't know.
Okay.
That's just me sort of being a little.
Did you want to follow up before we go to questions?
A little bit. So,
Tell me where I'm wrong.
no, I think you're right,
Co-authors
Professor.
can't
And
disagree.
look, I would say there's some room, when states are incorporating federal documents like NIST or some sort of policy guidance, it does at least leave some federal role, right? It's perhaps not the preferred role, but at least it does help provide, especially given certain, let's say, expertise or ability to, even if it's just expertise in bringing together stakeholders, which is an expertise of NIST, to hash this out, this being AI risk management. that is a capacity that doesn't tend to exist at the state level.
Yeah, it basically,
so-
the federal government's agencies serve as a federal advisory body for state lawmakers to premise their regulations on.
Is that
This
perhaps?
is, I would say this is an inversion of the internet model where this process was truly multi-stakeholder, bottom-up, consensus-based policy governance without having the hard law, bottom-up approach of the states layering on rules on top of a consensus-driven multi-stakeholder process. That's the difference, right? And the question is how that turns out. We'll see. We're going to find out. 762 bills will tell us at some point, I suppose. Before we go to questions, if anyone has one, Sarah
I've got a couple things to say
and
here.
Mike. Yeah, please.
I probably drafted more state legislation than anyone else in this room, and I don't say that as something I'm proud of. I'm just tired. But I would say two things. One, at the Rainey Center, we have polled in July and last month public views, public opinion on artificial intelligence, and consistently over 70% of the public want some sort of sensible regulation of this technology. They recognize that it's important, but they also recognize that there are dangers associated with this. Because of that, I think you will see the federal government as well as state governments pressured to act, and you're seeing that percolate up. The second thing that I would say is there's more than one way to skin a cat. There are ways that state governments and state legislative bodies and governors can pressure federal government action without passing and developing their own laws and regulations. There are things like resolutions. There are things like letters and proclamations. There are things like, some of the most effective advocacy I've ever seen is a governor texting, a United States senator or the chairman of an appropriations committee in Congress. There's more than one way to go about all of this, and I would say that you're probably going to see more of that coming in the future. So I'm optimistic, is what I'm saying, and I think that we're having these conversations is very good.
Cool. Mike, you want to say something? If anybody's got a question, line up.
Yeah, just a couple things. One, like, as I indicated earlier, I think that we are over-regulating on ChatGPT and large language models and ignoring the rest of the artificial intelligence ecosystem. And so that creates great risk of over-regulating even the simplest algorithms when when they don't present a danger because, we just do that with a broad sweep of a pen. I think that's a real risk. The second thing is, the economic competitiveness factor here is going to weigh in. This is it's not a winner take all, but it's winners take all. And we need to be a winner in this space. If we constrain this technology that we invented, then we're fools because the Chinese and the Europeans will take this to the bank. And eventually it'll be everybody else as well. A third thing to think about, algorithms can live anywhere. Right, they can live in Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, which is what Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates would prefer, that they can create all the energy they need, they can create the compute environments, and they can distribute inferences globally. That's a realistically practical approach. Yeah. And so, once again, U.S. regulation that constrains our companies from competing in that market is a real problem. And then my last point would be, look, the technology will change. We know the AI we know today, and I'm telling you, this is a moving train that's accelerating. And so what if we get comfortable with the AI that we know today, we will be obsolete tomorrow, right? And so and we have to think that way through a legislation process as well.
Yeah.
There, said by a non-lawyer.
Amen. That was great, Mike.
The question that my team gets, working with state policymakers all over the country, most about AI is not how do we regulate AI, it's how do we integrate AI into our governments so that we can better deliver more efficient services in a more cost-effective way for the public.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And on Mike's point about the global context of all this, this isn't just theory. We live in a world of global, innovation arbitrage right now, where innovators and investors flow wherever they're treated most hospitably. You mentioned UAE. They've got Falcon 180B, one of the biggest open source AI models in the whole planet. And, we're all paranoid about the Chinese, but the reality is that if you go to the Middle East right now, there's some of the most exciting things happening, and nobody's going to constrain that with an AI regulation in Sacramento. right? That's going to plow forward. Okay, so we've got some questions. Let's get to these. Sorry about that.
Adam, you jogged my memory that back in 1989 when I was at the U.S. Chamber, I testified on medical privacy. Two big issues in my testimony was of course, preemption, which we've talked about, but the other one was a private cause of action. And of course, the left wanted no preemption, and they wanted a private cause of action. We wanted preemption and no private cause of action. Of course, it never went anywhere. So my question is really on enforcement, which hasn't come up in any of this, and I always think enforcement gets a short shrift in these discussions where people focus on the substance of legislation, but they don't look at the back end of the bills, typically where the enforcement provisions are hidden. So in all these kinds of bills you guys have been talking about, Sarah, and state level or whatever, Adam, what's the typical enforcement mechanisms that are sort of embedded in these various bills you've been talking about, 700 or whatever it is? I just think it's an important issue because that's where the rubber meets the road when there's
Absolutely.
violation.
Yep, you got it right. Evangelos knows all about this.
Well, as a U.S. Chamber alum who used to work on privacy at the Chamber, I appreciate the question. I would say it varies. So the Colorado law, and I think most of the laws in the algorithmic discrimination model lean heavily on attorney general enforcement. And that is also true of most of the all of the comprehensive privacy laws that have been enacted to date by states. That is very intentional, I think, despite the very powerful trial bar that Professor Cooper mentioned. Earlier, I think it's been a fairly successful argument that these sorts of regulations are best kept in expert AG hands. That said, there are certainly no shortage of proposals with private rights of action that have been proposed. None, to my knowledge, have passed. That said, we've seen governors play an important role in trying to hold back private rights of action. So in Vermont, Phil Scott vetoed a bill that was ostensibly about privacy, was much broader, that diverged from the state model. His reasoning for vetoing it was not just the PRA, which was included, but also it diverged from neighboring states of Connecticut and New Hampshire.
I think that's interesting. That's why I have trouble with people talking about the tort model being an appropriate mechanism here. I don't think it is at all.
Yeah, that's right. Nathan, do we have time for one more before we close out? Okay, thanks. Kurt, I'm sorry.
Yes, a much more general question, which is derived from my UK background as a parliamentarian there, and also extensive work I did with the Financial Services Authority. One approach there is to, and might work at the federal level, or Congress I mean, and that is to have a set of general principles which could apply across the board to the different forms of AI. The set of general principles then limits the kind of detailed regulations that may be passed and may have to be enforced by different agencies, depending on how the general principle applied to the particular form of AI in question. It might be much simpler for Congress, well, it might be. It's much simpler in the UK Parliament, of course.
Yeah.
It might be simpler for Congress to agree on a set of general principles from which specific applications to specific forms of AI might apply. Just an idea.
Fair point. Anyone have a comment on that? I know when I used to live in London, I was always amazed how much easier it was to get agreement on something like that in a parliamentary system. However, and for better or for worse, America's checks and balances might make that hard. But does anybody have any random thoughts on that to close this out?
I have thoughts, but if others... So I think if you would ask folks in the Biden administration, they would say that those set of principles exist, not from Congress, but in the form of the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. That document is technically not official U.S. government policy, but has been held up as such, and includes a set of principles that, in theory, could guide regulation, and in some areas, including in the AI executive order, has incorporated those principles.
Well, and Nathan's going to come up here and close us out, but why don't you please join me in thanking this wonderful panel today.
Yes, two great papers, an excellent panel to conclude the day. Thank you all for your participation this afternoon. Throughout the day, both the papers and the discussion, I think, exceeded even our own lofty expectations. So I want to say thank you to all our contributors and our audience for joining us today. Before we break, I'd be remiss if I didn't also thank my FedSoc colleagues for their help in making today a smooth success. In particular, I want to express gratitude to Caroline Bryant and Grace Otto for their efforts. With that, refreshments will be available shortly across the hall where our discussions can continue. Until next time, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.